So I rewatched Crowder's response to the Maza/Vox video on curation aka gatekeeping. While I don't agree with everything in the Maza video, I found Crowder's response vacuous, and little more than a series of straw man arguments, non sequiturs and an excuse to slide in a few anti-gay jokes. Okay, so first let me explain the importance of curation. Forget politics for a moment. There are a billion things going on in the world at any given moment. News outlets can't possibly report on them all. Somewhere there is a world record being broken. There is also a raging wildfire. A Hollywood couple just broke up and made a huge spat over it on social media. Another school shooting just happened. Trump just published another mean tweet. Even on a 24-hour news cycle, there's too much to report. This is why curation is simply a matter of math. You literally cannot report everything. What Maza is referring to is how this plays itself out, specifically in the political world. Both the DNC and the RNC want their talking points to be covered by the mainstream media. Some of these talking points might actually have relevance outside of partisan point scoring, and so ideally they'll be included. I am not claiming that news outlets generally curate in a responsible manner, I am simply explaining the process. In fact, the ad revenue model really distorts this process and incentivizes the MSM to report on their version of clickbait. It also incentivizes them to ignore reporting on anything that might alienate advertisers. But I digress. Crowder responds to this with not just one, but two logical fallacies. First, the straw man argument that Maza said that gatekeeping aka curation was the most important job of a journalist, which is not what he said. Crowder also creates this false choice between curation and reporting the news correctly, as if you can only do one and not the other.
Important here. Yeah. They think the most important role of journalism should be to be gatekeepers.
Right, deciding what we see.
We know that it should be to inform the public. They want to actually decide what information the public has access to. They say that's the most important role of journalism. How about the most important role is getting it right?
Yeah.
So keep all this in mind because we're going to come back to it.
Now, let's run a thought experiment. You're a local news station and you find out there's a hurricane headed into your area of coverage. You don't have all of the details, but you generally know it's going to be a severe one. On the other hand, you just found out that Bobo the chimpanzee at the local zoo just broke the world's peanut throwing record. You have all of the facts and can report this story with 100% accuracy. Which of these stories are you going to prioritize? I know this is an extreme comparison, but I want to highlight why accuracy, while obviously important, can indeed take a backseat to curation. Now, I am not claiming that networks like CNN do a great job of reporting what's relevant, nor that they would be doing so were it not for the influence of Fox News. I am just explaining the basic concept of curation and why it's a necessary part of journalism. Rewinding to something less important but more amusing is Crowder's inability to read a basic chart. He claims that no one under 50 watches the news when it's plain as day from the chart he displays that they do.
Break it on the idea that you need television to consume media.
Right.
The numbers show us, of course, that if you're under 50, you're not getting your news from TV at all. Also, by the way,
So then Crowder addresses Benghazi.
this attack on a United States facility and Americans died. In what world is that not newsworthy?
Fake news.
Only the world where you believe that your job as a journalist is not to provide people with valid information, but
While I don't quite agree with the lengths at which the Vox video downplays Benghazi, the overall argument is correct. The media focus far outweighed its relevance in the grand scheme of things. You see, this was just one of many embassy strikes where Americans unfortunately died.
You have 4 people dead, including the first U.S. ambassador in more than 30 years. How do you call that hype?
How many security contractors died in Iraq, do you know?
I don't.
No, nobody does, because nobody cared. We know that several hundred died, but there was never an official count done of security contractors dead in Iraq. So when I see this focus on what was essentially a small firefight, I think, number one, I've covered a lot of firefights. It's impossible to figure out what happens in them sometimes. And second, I think that the emphasis on Benghazi has been extremely political, partly because Fox was operating as a wing of the Republican Party.
All right. Tom Ricks, thanks very much for joining us today.
A GOP goon would later admit that this was a political move.
Everybody thought Hillary Clinton was unbeatable, right? But we put together a Benghazi special committee, a select committee. What are her numbers today? Her numbers are dropping. Why?
The family of the fallen were asking that their deceased relatives not be used as a prop. Over 10 investigations were conducted and no wrongdoing was found. Every argument that isn't a non sequitur was answered in these reports, but the GOP and their news wing continued to quote-unquote raise questions they claimed they wanted answers to. Answers that were contained in the numerous reports they were pretending didn't exist. Reports that were conducted by nonpartisan as well as Republican committees. Crowder also addresses an argument that the Maza Vox video doesn't make.
From NBC, Universal, and Vice can get $400 million from Disney? Or do you want a world like Canada, or Venezuela, or the BBC? I know what I'd choose.
If complaining about the nature of how corporate news operates is tantamount to wishing for a world without news options, then Crowder's anti-SJW obsession is tantamount to wishing for an end to freedom of speech. Crowder goes on to mention instances where CNN's relationship to the DNC mirrors Fox News' relationship to the RNC. However, he claims that this is a relationship with the actual left.
On one side, I get it, Fox News does that, they focus on minutiae, but if we want to talk about, and this isn't just whataboutism, I think it's far more severe on the left. Trump Russia, Trump tweets, Melania looking sad, that was one where they were talking about how looked like she was a prisoner in her marriage. Half of CNN's 16-hour original clock is nothing more than junior staff trying to quell Brian Stelter's erection from Trump's latest typo. Not in real media.
I am not really sure about this characterization. Watch any of the left-wing YouTubers with any sizable following and see if they care about Trump's tweets or about him staring into the sun. These things are just distractions from policies the left wants covered. This is not left-wing news, this is DNC-TMZ. How often does CNN cover economic history? How often do they educate viewers on the fact that the right has gotten its way economically over the last 40 years? Top marginal tax rates on individuals and corporations and unionization rates have been slashed to levels not seen since the days of the Great Depression. Income inequality has returned to those levels. The U.S. has the highest income inequality among advanced nations. We are closer to Mexico and Chile than to our European and Canadian counterparts. When Trump lackeys show up on CNN and babble on about Trump's economic growth, how often does the CNN host respond with graphs showing that he merely inherited a falling unemployment rate? When Trump lackeys boast about GDP growth under Trump, how often does CNN show a graph that illustrates higher growth rates under Obama? When they talk about jobs coming back under Trump, how often does the host mention that jobs have been reshoring since at least 2015 but that we still have a net gain of jobs leaving the United States? When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez went on CNN, Jake Tapper grilled her on how she would pay for progressive policies. He was double counting on the healthcare costs. He didn't mention the fact that Medicare for all was actually more cost-effective than our current system once you account for both private and public expenditures. Meaning that most of the progressive policies would be paid for when you account for the $4 trillion in savings that Medicare for all would bring, and this is without even mentioning partially rolling back decades of tax cuts for the 1%. So no, there is nothing left-wing about CNN other than perhaps on social issues, which really just means they're not stuck in the 1950s. On foreign policy, they're almost indistinguishable from Fox News.